The air in the Big Thompson Canyon does not just sit there. It feels heavy, like it is pressing against your skin, trying to find a way inside your lungs before you are ready for it. Up there in the Comanche Peak Wilderness of Colorado, the granite teeth of the Rockies do not care about your plans or your family vacations. The terrain is a jagged, unforgiving sprawl of fallen timber, loose scree, and shadows that seem to move even when the sun is high and bright. It was October 2nd, 1999, a day that should have been defined by the crisp smell of drying pine needles and the sound of the Poudre River churning over ancient stones. Instead, it became the starting point for a mystery that defies every law of logic and every rule of the natural world. Jaryd Atadero was only 3 years old when he stepped into that landscape. He was a small boy full of the kind of aimless, vibrating energy that only a toddler possesses. He was wearing a red fleece jacket, blue sweatpants, and a pair of sturdy little sneakers. He was with a group of 11 adults, members of a Christian singles group that his father Jaryd Atadero had joined. They were hiking toward the Big South Trail, a path that winds through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in the state. You would think that with 11 sets of eyes, a 3-year-old would be the safest person on the planet. You would think that the collective gaze of a dozen people would act like a cage, keeping the world out and the child in. But the wilderness does not work on the buddy system. Jaryd had been running back and forth between the hikers, a common game for a child on a trail. He ran ahead of the lead group, just around a bend, just out of sight for a matter of seconds. When the adults rounded that same bend, expecting to see a small boy in a red jacket waiting for them or perhaps hiding behind a tree, there was nothing. The trail was empty. The woods were silent. The transition from presence to absence was instantaneous, as if the boy had simply been edited out of the frame of reality. The initial panic is always a low-frequency hum before it turns into a scream. The group called his name, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls and returning to them hollow and mocking. They searched the immediate brush, thinking he might have tumbled down toward the river or climbed a small embankment. They found nothing. No scuff marks in the dirt. No broken branches. No tiny footprints in the soft earth near the water. It was as if Jaryd had learned to fly, or had been plucked from the earth by a silent, invisible hand. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley, the reality of the situation began to settle in like a cold fog. The search that followed was one of the largest in Colorado history. Hundreds of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, bloodhounds and helicopters, equipped with infrared sensors, descended on the area. They combed every square inch of that trail. They put divers in the river, despite the water being clear enough to see the bottom in most places. They flew over the canopy looking for that shock of red fleece against the dull browns and greens of the autumn forest. The bloodhounds, animals capable of tracking a scent through rain and wind, did something strange. They reached a certain point on the trail and then simply sat down. They lost the scent completely, as if the trail had gone cold in mid-air. Days turned into weeks. The weather turned. A massive snowstorm rolled in, burying the canyon in a thick white shroud that ended the active search for the season. The investigators were baffled. There was no evidence of a struggle. There was no evidence of an animal attack. A mountain lion or a bear leaves a mess. They leave blood, clothing fragments, and a clear trail of a struggle. There was none of that. Jaryd was just gone. His father, Alan, was left with a hole in his life that no amount of searching could fill, a victim of a mountain that seemed to have swallowed his son whole without leaving so much as a crumb. 4 years passed. 4 years of silence, of cold leads, and of a father staring at the mountains with a mixture of hatred and longing. Then, in May of 2003, 2 hikers named Stony Birch and Rob Schaefer were trekking off-trail high above the Big South Trail. They were at an elevation of about 9,000 feet on a steep, treacherous ridge that required significant effort to reach. This was not a place a 3-year-old could wander to on his own. It was a vertical climb through dense brush and over jagged rock faces that would exhaust a fit adult. And there, in the middle of nowhere, they found something that stopped their hearts. They found a single shoe, a small blue and white sneaker sitting on the ground. It was not weathered as much as you would expect for 4 years in the elements. The rubber was still supple. The laces were still intact. Near the shoe they found a pair of blue sweatpants and a red fleece jacket. The clothing was neatly arranged, but there was a chilling detail that the investigators would later emphasize. The clothing was inside out. The pants were inside out. The jacket was inside out. It was as if the boy had been peeled out of his clothes like a grape. When the authorities arrived to process the scene, they found even grimmer evidence. They found a fragment of a human skull and a single tooth. DNA testing confirmed the nightmare. It was Jaryd, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. The clothes were found in an area that had been searched by helicopters 4 years earlier. How could a red jacket lying on a grey rock be missed by infrared and high-resolution cameras? And more importantly, how did a 3-year-old child with short legs and no climbing gear manage to ascend 550 feet of vertical elevation from the point where he was last seen? If you look at the clothing under a microscope, the mystery becomes visceral. The shoes showed almost no wear on the soles. If Jaryd had hiked or crawled up that mountain, those sneakers should have been shredded by the sharp granite and the abrasive soil. Instead, they looked almost new, as if they had been placed there by someone or something rather than worn there. There was no blood on the clothing. No large tears that would indicate a predator dragging a body through the brush. The clothing was just there, inverted and empty, sitting on a high ridge that the boy could never have reached on his own. There is a theory in these cases, a dark whisper among those who study the missing. They call it high-altitude displacement. It is the idea that something in these wilderness areas has the ability to move a person from point A to point B without crossing the physical space in between. It sounds like science fiction until you are standing on a ridge looking down at the spot where a child vanished, realizing the sheer physical impossibility of the journey. If an animal had taken him, why were the clothes neatly inverted? Why was the skull fragment found so far from any other skeletal remains? A mountain lion caches its prey, but it does not undress it. The silence of the Comanche Peak Wilderness is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a predator that is already full. When you walk those trails, you can feel the weight of the history there. You can feel the thousands of eyes that are not human watching from the tree line. We like to think we are at the top of the food chain because we have GPS and Gore-Tex, but Jaryd Atadero proved that those things are just toys when the mountain decides to take what it wants. The boy in the red fleece became a ghost before he ever became a man, leaving behind only questions that have no comfortable answers. The case of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident. It fits a chilling pattern of disappearances in our national parks and wilderness areas. Children and adults alike vanish in the presence of others, only to have their remains or clothing found years later in impossible locations, often at much higher elevations, and often with their clothing turned inside out. It is a signature of something we do not understand, a phenomenon that operates outside the boundaries of conventional search and rescue logic. Consider the disappearance of Bobby Bizup in 1958. He was a 10-year-old boy who vanished from a church camp in the Rocky Mountains, not far from where Jaryd disappeared. Despite an intensive search, nothing was found until a year later when his clothing and a few bone fragments were discovered on a high, inaccessible ridge. Like Jaryd, the condition of the clothing and the location of the remains defied explanation. These are not just accidents. They are part of a grim, recurring geometry of the unknown that suggests we are never truly alone when we step off the pavement and into the trees. The air in the Comanche Peak Wilderness does not circulate like the air in the valleys below. It is heavy, stagnant, and carries a scent that defies the clean pine-scented postcards sold in the gift shops. It smells of old granite, wet wool, and something metallic like a copper coin resting on a dead tongue. When you stand where Jaryd Atadero was last seen, you do not feel the majesty of the Rockies. You feel a crushing claustrophobic weight despite the vastness of the horizon. The physical evidence left behind in these woods is not just sparse, it is insulting to the human intellect. We found his clothing years later, but it did not look like it had been subjected to 4 seasons of Colorado winters. The red fleece was too bright. The shoes, those small blue sneakers, still had the factory tread visible on the soles. If a 3-year-old boy had climbed those jagged vertical miles on his own, those shoes should have been shredded to ribbons by the abrasive soil. Instead, they looked almost new, as if they had been placed there by someone or something rather than worn there. There was no blood on the clothing. No large tears that would indicate a predator dragging a body through the brush. No biological spray that follows a jagged tooth or a sharp claw. The clothing was just there, inverted and empty, sitting on a high ridge that the boy could never have reached on his own. It was as if the person inside had simply ceased to exist, leaving their shell behind like a cicada. There is a theory in these cases. A dark whisper among those of us who spend our nights staring at topographical maps and missing persons reports. They call it high-altitude displacement. It is the idea that something in these wilderness areas has the ability to move a person from point alpha to point beta without crossing the physical space in between. It sounds like science fiction until you are standing on a ridge, looking down at the spot where a child vanished, realizing the sheer physical impossibility of the journey. If an animal had taken him, why were the clothes neatly inverted? Why was the skull fragment found so far from any other skeletal remains perched on a ledge that required technical climbing gear to access? A mountain lion caches its prey, but it does not undress it. A bear is a messy eater, leaving a trail of carnage that the crows find within minutes. But here, there was nothing. No crows, no flies, no struggle. Just the silence of the peaks. The silence of the Comanche Peak Wilderness is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a predator that is already full. When you walk those trails, you can feel the weight of the history there. You can feel the thousands of eyes that are not human watching from the tree line. We like to think we are at the top of the food chain because we have global positioning systems and high-end outdoor gear. But Jaryd Atadero proved that those things are just toys when the mountain decides to take what it wants. The boy in the red fleece became a ghost before he ever became a man, leaving behind only questions that have no comfortable answers. His father, Alan, spent years in a state of suspended grief, a man haunted by the two hikers who claimed they heard a scream or perhaps a whistle coming from a place where no one should have been. The case of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident. It fits a chilling pattern of disappearances in our national parks and wilderness areas. Children and adults alike vanish in the presence of others, often only feet away, only to have their remains or clothing found years later in impossible locations. These spots are often at much higher elevations, and the clothing is frequently found turned inside out or inverted. It is a signature of something we do not understand, a phenomenon that operates outside the boundaries of conventional search and rescue logic. It is a grim, recurring geometry of the unknown that suggests we are never truly alone when we step off the pavement and into the trees. Think about the texture of that red fleece when they found it. It was not matted with mud. It was not bleached white by the high-altitude sun. It sat there on the rock, a vibrant screaming red against the grey granite, as if it had been dropped from a great height only moments before the searchers arrived. But Jaryd had been gone for 4 years. Where had that fleece been for those 1,460 days? The investigators looked at the stitching. They looked at the fibers under a microscope. They were looking for the marks of a mountain lion's incisors, but all they found was the absence of a struggle. The pants were found nearby, also inverted. To invert a pair of pants requires a specific two-handed motion. It requires a level of dexterity that a 3-year-old struggling for his life simply does not possess. It requires intent. There is a coldness that settles in your bones when you realize that the natural world is not just indifferent but potentially predatory in a way that defies our biology. We are used to the idea of wolves and bears. We understand the hunger of a mountain lion. We can categorize those threats. But how do you categorize a force that picks up a child and deposits a single fragment of his skull 500 feet above the trail on a sheer cliff face? How do you explain the lack of scent for the bloodhounds? In the Atadero case, the dogs were useless. They sniffed the air, they whined, and then they sat down. They refused to work. It was as if the scent trail did not stop. It simply ended, as if Jaryd had been lifted straight up into the thin, cold air. The searchers who combed those hillsides in 1999 were seasoned veterans. They knew every drainage, every rock slide, every thicket of mountain mahogany. They walked over the very spot where the remains were eventually found. They found nothing. No red fleece. No blue shoes. No bone fragments. Then years later, when the energy of the search had faded into a dull ache, the mountain gave back a few pieces of the puzzle, but it kept the picture for itself. This is the part that keeps me awake at night. The idea that the landscape itself is a participant. That the trees and the rocks are not just scenery but a mouth. We talk about the missing, as if they are lost, but being lost implies you are still somewhere on the map. What if these people are no longer on the map? What if the displacement is not just physical, but something more fundamental? We see it in the clothing. The inversion. It is a recurring detail in hundreds of cases. It suggests a stripping away of the human element. When a person is taken by this phenomenon, they are often found without their shoes, even in sub-zero temperatures. Their clothes are found in a pile or scattered in a way that suggests they were removed in a state of terminal burrowing or paradoxical undressing. But those are symptoms of hypothermia. Jaryd disappeared in the warmth of a July afternoon. Hypothermia does not fit. Consider the disappearance of Bobby Bizup in 1958. He was a 10-year-old boy who vanished from a church camp in the Rocky Mountains not far from where Jaryd would disappear decades later. Bobby was hearing impaired, a detail that often surfaces in these cases as if the phenomenon targets those with slight sensory differences. Despite an intensive search involving hundreds of volunteers and military personnel, nothing was found. Not a footprint, not a scrap of his camp uniform. Then a year later, his clothing and a few bone fragments were discovered on a high, inaccessible ridge. Like Jaryd, the condition of the clothing and the location of the remains defied explanation. Bobby's shoes were found, and like Jaryd's, they showed almost no wear. He would have had to cross miles of some of the most rugged terrain in North America to reach that ridge. A 10-year-old boy alone in the dark without leaving a single trace. These are not just accidents. These are not just cases of a child wandering off and getting lost. There is a deliberate nature to the locations where the remains are found. They are often found in areas that have already been searched multiple times. They are found in spots that overlook the search coordinates, almost as if the remains were placed there to be found once the heat had died down. It is a taunt, a signature left by something that does not fear us. When you look at the map of these disappearances, they cluster. They cluster around bodies of water, around boulder fields, and in areas with high concentrations of granite. There is something about the geology of these places that seems to facilitate the impossible. We are told that the wilderness is a place to find ourselves, but for Jaryd Atadero and Bobby Bizup it was a place where they were erased. The mountain does not care about your survival kits. It does not care about your frantic calls into the darkness. It only cares about the silence. The more you look into these cases, the more the world starts to feel thin. Like a piece of paper that has been folded too many times. You start to see the creases. You start to realize that the trail you are walking on is only a suggestion, and that the real world, the one that Jaryd encountered, is something much older and much hungrier than we dare to admit. I think about Jaryd Atadero often. I think about the man standing on that trail clutching a small red fleece that looks like it just came off the department store shelf, knowing in his heart that his son did not walk to that ridge. I think about the way the wind sounds when it whistles through the canyons of the Comanche Peak Wilderness. It does not sound like wind. It sounds like a low, rhythmic breathing. We are not the masters of this domain. We are guests who have overstayed our welcome, and occasionally the mountain reminds us of that fact. It takes a child in a red fleece. It takes a boy from a church camp. It leaves behind a shoe, an inverted jacket, and a silence that lasts for eternity. As you sit in your home with the doors locked and the lights on, it is easy to dismiss these stories as anomalies. It is easy to say that the search has missed something, or that a mountain lion is more clever than we give it credit for. But when you look at the totality of the evidence, the pattern becomes undeniable. The high-altitude displacement, the lack of scent, the pristine clothing, the inverted garments. It is a formula. A grim, recurring geometry. Jaryd Atadero was not lost. He was taken. And the thing that took him is still out there waiting in the shadows of the granite peaks, watching the next group of hikers as they step off the pavement and into the trees. The case of Jaryd Atadero remains one of the most haunting entries in the chronicles of the missing, a testament to the fact that there are places in this world where the laws of physics and the laws of nature seem to buckle. We are left with the shards of a life and the cold comfort of a closed case file that explains nothing. The mountain has its secrets, and it guards them with a ferocity that should terrify us all. Take, for instance, the case of Keith Parkins, who in 1952 vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Oregon. He was only 2 years old. He was found 19 hours later, alive nearly 12 miles away, having crossed multiple mountain ranges and fences that a grown man would struggle to navigate in that time frame. Like Jaryd, his journey was a physical impossibility, a leap across the map that defies every logic we possess. Then there is the disappearance of DeOrr Kunz Jr. in 2015, a case that still ripples through the heart of the Idaho wilderness. A 2-year-old boy vanishes while his parents are less than 50 feet away in an open area with nowhere to hide. No tracks, no struggle, no sound. It is the same void, the same sudden erasure of a human life that we see in the Atadero and Bizup cases. These stories are not just warnings for hikers. They are reminders that we live in a world that is far more mysterious and far more dangerous than our modern lives allow us to believe. When you head out into the wild, remember the red fleece. Remember the blue shoes. And remember that the silence you hear might not be the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting for you to look away.